think about death, do you lose your breath or do you keep your cool? Would you like to see the Pope on the end of a rope? Do you think he's a fool? Well, I've seen the truth. Yes, I've seen the light, and I've changed my ways, and I'll be prepared when you're lonely and scared at the end of our days. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Thunderdome Metal Reviews. With me I am Tracey Newport, and with me, as always, is the Reverend Benjamin Lindsay and the Dr. David Pizzo. If you are new finding us on YouTube, we have been doing this journey for 2 years. This is our 2-year anniversary, and as is tradition here at Thunderdome, we look at a Black Sabbath album and go back to the forefathers of metal. And with it being our second anniversary, we started with Black Sabbath self-titled, then looked at Paranoid, and we are doing Master of Reality. Gentlemen, how y'all doing tonight?
I'm pretty good, man. I can't believe the journey, as you say, has been this long. I sort of got on in the midpoint, so I'm also a bit of a late adopter, but I'm really glad to be here, and I love that we have some very special guests appearing from undisclosed locations.
I was going to introduce them after we got through our...
You would.
Well, it's too late for that now.
I know it is. And we have some gentlemen that join us occasionally for these journeys, and it is Gabe and Buck.
Hey, y'all.
Chris, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Welcome.
We love to have you. Tracey, should we talk just a tiny bit about who at least the three of us are? And I actually kind of would love to hear from Buck and Gabe too, just about like our connection to metal, what we're into, just a little bit to sort of acquaint people with our vantage points, if you will.
We should. Has Benjamin said hello yet?
No, because we fucked it up. So Ben, how are you doing?
On that. I'm doing good. So I am the Reverend Dangerously, at least on Twitter. How I got involved in metal, I come from a musical family. Both of my parents played in bands. I have played in bands, metal bands. I heard my first heavy metal-ish glam rock song in '84 because I'm old as fuck. I was born in '76. That was Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer, and I've been hooked ever since. Thankfully, I had some friends who later became bandmates who hooked me into some harder stuff. And, you know, I've been on this ride. And then one day, after going to an academic conference together, Tracey and I were sitting in a Buffalo Wild Wings, and we had this crazy idea to start recording ourselves talking about metal albums because he was already doing like 180 character album reviews on Twitter, which I'll let him talk more about. And thus Thunderdome Metal Reviews was born, and here we are at 273 albums reviewed, starting our 3rd year.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm the Dr. David Pizzo. I'm a history professor by day. In terms of metal, I got on the ride around the same time as Ben. I'm also old. I'm Gen X, so I was born in '77, and I started listening to metal in '89, '90. I really got on the ride at Rust in Peace by Megadeth and Persistence of Time and Seasons in the Abyss. So I hit right at that sort of Cowboys from Hell, that sort of wave of metal, and sort of was along for every trend thereafter. You know, I was ride or die for thrash and still am. I was very into death metal and still am. I feel like that's more of me and Buck's zone, maybe getting into the extreme metal. I was on the ride for the new metal thing, and I'm not sorry about it. I think some of it was okay, some of it was terrible. And you know, I listened to metal a bit less as I got older because I did things like, you know, marry a normal human and have a child. But Thunderdome Metal Reviews has led to a disastrous renaissance in terms of metal returning and being omnipresent on all fronts. And I'm happy to report my daughter really likes Slayer. Indeed, she walked in today and said, "Turn this corn crap off, and I need you to fire up Seasons in the Abyss," and I did.
So you're a good parent.
That literally happened. She's like, "Turn this off. I want Seasons now." Well, what she wants, she gets. Anyway, What's your deal, Tracey?
So I am a couple years younger. So I'm about a decade younger than the Reverend and the Doctor. I got into metal vicariously through wrestling I was watching WCW at the time, and that was when Sting and Goldberg each came out with, Goldberg was Crush 'Em on Megadeth, and Sting was Seek and Destroy by Metallica. And so at 12 years old, I went to Hot Topic with my grandmother, and I was like, I remember this song that Sting came out to, and so I bought that album that song was on, and it happened to be Metallica Kill 'Em All. And I have been on this metal train, ride or die, since. I am probably the most of the three of us. I am the most specific metal. Like I don't really branch out into other genres very much, but I tend to view metal as a larger tent than they do typically. As I got into metal, I fell deep into the progressive hole, and metalcore is about where I probably dug my roots in the most in there, with especially that mid to late 2000s metalcore wave, the Kill Switch, All That Remains, Shadows Fall. And for me, around 2017, 2018, I was looking at best stuff lists like, man, I missed a lot of good metal that came out this year. It's like, you know what, that's not going to happen again. I'm going to find good metal as it comes out. And so I started Coleco Metal Reviews, which has now been defunct since the beginning of the year because I've been busy with life. But I turned into my music habit into where I'd listen to new metal albums as they came out. And it's turned into, just to give it perspective, as of this point in time this year, I have listened to over 11,000 albums from start to finish for this year. Or not 11,000, 1,100. 11,000 would be fucking insane. I don't think it's human possible.
1,100 is also insane, but 11,000 would be
Yeah.
next fucking level.
I know. I was like, how did you, like, while you were asleep, you had headphones on and just new metal was happening? Okay, that's insane. I have not listened to that many albums this year.
You guys are also crazy enough to track it. I'll say that. I thought it'd be good to see, hey, let's see what my metal listens through, and I'll use the spreadsheet and get all the data that I could get off of it instead of using a program that may spy on me on my phone when I did it. So there's that. So yeah, I just listen to a lot of metal music. A lot. And Buck and Gabe, tell us about yourselves and your journey into metal.
Gabe, you want to go first?
I can. So I'm a real latecomer here, but I'm really happy to be on this ride. I would say I've probably been actively listening to metal for about 10, 12 years. I encountered subgenres of metal pretty early on in my life. I suppose in high school, I was in a band with a guy who's also in a metalcore band, and I'd never even heard of or seen anything like that until I went to one of his shows. But I didn't really ever actively listen to it until I discovered a television show on Adult Swim called Metalocalypse. And this was maybe 2008, 2009. I started getting really into it. And then I saw a call for papers. I'm an academic like David. It was a call for papers for a conference in Germany about metal and politics. And I said, I would like to write about Metalocalypse, and I'd like to write about the pilot, please. And so they took me on. I went there and I met a bunch of other German and other nationality metalheads. And they told me all about the good stuff that is to be discovered in the world there. And I was sold. So that's sort of how it began. And you guys can read the paper now. It's published, but it's in German, unfortunately. It is, however, about the first episode of Metalocalypse. And I've been getting really into, so I was interested in death metal academically, put it that way. And that was sort of my gateway to trying to understand and trying to enjoy more of this genre. I'm a music fan since I was little, and I played music growing up. But this was sort of like, yeah, these last 10 years was sort of my first foray and really intense, where my interest grew.
I just want to briefly interject the hilarious memory of me dragging Gabe in 2003 to an abandoned Nazi airport to watch Ministry.
Yes, that was also pivotal. And it was in 2003, right?
Yes, that was 03.
And David was basically, I had never listened to Ministry really before. Like I'd maybe in passing saw it on MTV on Beavis and Butthead, and like he was just like, you got to come to this show. And I was like,
It'll change your life.
And it did.
And I will say that we are also all academics in some way, shape, or form, and we should probably do something like what you did in Germany here.
We should.
Totally.
I just want to ask Gabe, you wrote your paper about the Dunking Hills coffee jingle and how Metalocalypse or Death Clock as a force within the world economy at the time could crash economies just by playing a fucking jingle.
Yeah, I did write about that. And it's really ironic that it took the mainstreaming of metal and then the parody of the mainstreaming of metal to get me excited about it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of weird.
I'm just wondering, because when was that? Because they did the episode where Nathan became the Florida governor, which is a little foresight to today.
Yeah, I mean, so the conference was in 2013, and you'd be surprised, a lot of people who were Germans at this conference hadn't heard of the show. So the show obviously hadn't reached as many people as it could have in European metal markets, where I think it would be huge, you know?
Oh, yeah. Sorry to cut introductions off. Buck, what about yourselves?
Yeah, so my name is Buck Thornton. My online handle is Dungeon Shaker, ripped from the Dark Throne song, because I'm really creative like that. I run Thunderous Voices, a not defunct, but it's dormant YouTube channel that's not rather dormant because I've been busy with life as well. My metal journey, I'm going to be cheesy here, is so I grew up in rural North Dakota, so I wasn't naturally exposed to heavy metal. Actually, it was something that was discouraged when I was getting into it. I remember my mom pulling out my Slayer CDs and be like, "Do you want to go to hell?" And of course I said yes, because you have to answer a question like that with a yes. But what introduced me to heavy metal was my father had a couple Metallica cassettes, Black Album Load, I think Reload, sometime in the late 90s. So we go on fishing trips and stuff, and he'd pull out the Black Album, and that was really that's what really turned me on to heavy metal. And ever since then, it's just been it's been an obsession of mine. You know, you start with Metallica, you go into the big four, Iron Maiden, Metallica, Sabbath, and whatnot. It's pretty it's a rather generic trajectory, but it's one that I've enjoyed, and I'm still on that ride. Some of my favorite genres are, I had a huge doom metal phase a few years ago. I still love that stuff. Some of the extreme stuff, black metal, death metal, power metal. I consider some power metal to be an extreme genre of music, which is a rather contentious hot take.
I don't know. They some of the power metal acts, that has to be extreme for how far they go.
Yeah, that's my argument. I've been really into the first Rhapsody album lately, and there's some stuff on there tempo wise that you know it's a death metal tempo. It's extreme in a different kind of way, but we're getting a little off topic here. So
What about Diggy Diggy Doug?
no comment. yeah. That's a little bit about me. So
All
Sweet.
right. So
That's who we are. So
that is.
I guess, Ben, you should give us some statistics and information about this album.
Sure. Master of Reality. It's their third studio album, released on July 21st of 1971. So it is turning 50 this year. It was recorded in Island Studios in London, United Kingdom, released on Vertigo. The producer was Roger Bain, has a runtime of 34 minutes and 29 seconds. The band you know and love, Ozzy Osbourne on lead vocals, Tony Iommi, on guitar, synthesizer, flute, and piano, Geezer Butler on bass, and Bill Ward on drums, percussion, and sleigh bell. So, Master of Reality, who wants to start with their thoughts first?
I will say that I think this is their Jethro Tull moment.
Because
I call
flute.
Well, they have a lot of proggy sound on this album, especially on the back half. Like, it's not traditional, which you would call, I guess you would say, well, you got Sweet Leaf, After Forever, Embryo, and Children of Grave. And Children of Grave kind of is that borderline, but later into the rest of the album, though, they step into much more progressive sound that you saw at the time coming around with Jethro Tull, some bit of the Doors, and like that was starting to rise up in the 70s of like that progressive rock era. And so some of that's bleeding into their songwriting on this album.
I don't know if
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if I quite agree with that. Certainly when you start getting into your Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage era, then yeah. But I think this early, I don't know, it's just a little too heavy for Jethro Tull.
Well, like I just was saying, like the side A, it's heavier than side B. Like
yeah,
you kind of like their writing is kind of, instead of like Paranoid, which is full on heavy metal and like the birth of it. You're starting to see kind of like a callback to what they did in their first album here with like The Wizard and, let's go look it up. But you're starting to get kind of more of their progressive, like synth abilities are showing again in this album comparatively.
I don't know. I see tracks like Solitude, and which I mean to me is just another like Planet Caravan Part 2 as
Exactly.
It's definitely
it is really what Solitude is. I mean, it's
This is to
it's
me
creative. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call it progressive yet, but I mean that shit's mostly just antics.
I don't compare it to Jethro Tull. Aqualung comes out this same year in 71. The Doors, Morrison dies this year, so they're kind of, even though they do release some more albums into the 70s, this is to me is much more that English blues rock thing. It's them filtering Led Zeppelin and trying to create a Led Zeppelin record. I see it as more that than a Jethro Tull or progressive thing.
I think the drug influence is stern on this.
Strong. I mean, they open with it. Yeah, I had never really listened to this album. I'd heard, a song or two off it, the really famous ones, Children of the Grave or whatever. So this was my first time spinning it, and I was impressed how slow and heavy it was. I hadn't realized. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to go as far as to say this is when Doom was invented, but kind of. And I know this is more Buck's realm. Other two things I'll say is, this sounds so self-evident to say, but there were no genres yet like we're thinking of, so they could kind of do whatever they wanted, if that makes any sense. They weren't constrained by this sort of soul searching, what am I doing right now? They didn't care. They were two. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, at the same time, like, Tracey says this is like a kind of so proggy. I feel like they're just dipping their toes in the water.
Mm-hmm.
It's very apparent that they're not sure about it and that it's an experiment, and especially in the case of like Solitude. Embryo is just like, I don't know, it's a kind of a
it's a thing.
So I feel like they do know that they're doing something different, and reading about like the process of recording it, they were conscious of doing something different and kind of afraid of it, but I think that the results are pretty darn good.
Yeah, it's a cool album. I mean, those other albums were recorded, the first one literally in 2 days, and Paranoid was not a lot longer than that. So the fact that they could play around like this was very new for them. The other thing I wanted to say a second ago is I really want to double down on Ben's comment. The lineage to Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters is very clear here. The debt that metal owes to essentially African Americans from like Mississippi and Alabama, because that's what created that whole, Clapton and, well, everything, the Doors, Beatles, all of it. And I feel like that debt sometimes is not acknowledged sufficiently, and it is very clear on this album. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to put it out there, not, just sort of be woke or something, though, but literally it is a black art form that was refracted through sort of the British experience that gave us this.
And I think it's also kind of, I 100% agree with everything David just said, because I mean, all those, the Cream, Led Zeppelin, all of them cut their teeth, Rolling Stones, playing blues songs that were just covers. But I think it's worth noting here that this is 71. It's the third album. Their first one came out in 69, almost 70. And then the next one comes out in 70. So this is an incredibly rapid succession to crank out 3 albums of such quality, might I add, because all 3 of these albums, Black Sabbath, which I really think is where the Doom thing, the track 1, album 1, Black Sabbath, that's a Doom song, whether it was intentionally a Doom song or not. But for them to have released 3 strong albums in essentially, you might as well say 2 years, is fucking amazing.
Yeah, they were churning albums out.
Mm. The production on this album is pretty amazing, I have to say, and I don't think just on the remaster. This is actually the last one that Bane did, because Iommi took over in the chair after this, and he did assist on here. Also, Ben, when you were mentioning Judas Priest, Tom Allom did the engineering, who did a bunch of Judas Priest later. So, yeah, no, that's who the engineer was on this album. Yeah, one of the things that really struck me, this album, listening to it again, or some of these songs again on the album for the first time, it was a reminder how much of the music we love would not exist. And again, I know this is self-evident, but this really needs to be said. So much of what I love, it just wouldn't exist without this. Whether it's the desert rock scene or Clutch, or, I mean, just about everything sort of builds on top of this. And it had been a while since I'd sort of pondered the sort of unhappy accident of Tomi Iommi getting 2 fingers chopped off and then having to like down tune to hack it, and the sound that created. So it was sort of serendipity. One thing that made me wonder though is how the fuck did he play flute? I know that's not well. I mean, I was like, wait, I guess the keys are easier with your fingertips missing anyway. But that happy accident, we reviewed, and I'm not sure when it'll come out versus this, the Black album recently, and that sort of, down-tuned low thing. This is where all of that starts. So, and I have a lot to say about all their individual sounds, but I know we're trying to get everyone's kind of.
Glad you brought that point up, David, because it is. I mean, you have to emphasize a point like that. Like when you're discussing these early Sabbath records, it's so easy to go down a rabbit hole of categorization. And is this doom metal? Is this metal? Is this blues? Is this et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But kind of you kind of have to though with Sabbath though, because I mean, looking at some of these track lists is like, you look at Into the Void. I mean, you can hear Slayer in that song. Same thing with Children of the Grave. Like there's some thrash metal, proto thrash metal elements in there, and there's so many so many little metal genres littered throughout those first handful of Sabbath albums. Like you said, it just speaks to it. Like this is the foundation. Like this isn't Zeppelin. This is another level. This isn't Cream or Clapton or the Yardbirds or whoever. This is the genesis of heavy metal. Whether it's the first Sabbath album, the second or the third is arbitrary. It's like this sound is something new, but very, very, very much rooted, in what you described, the blues rock of the South, or the blues of the South and whatnot. So it is one of like these 3 albums, especially the first 3 are such interesting albums to consider, especially in hindsight, and they're monumental. I mean, they're great too.
They are.
Like
critics,
Zeppelin records.
Critics hated this album. They really
Well, they
did.
hated all 3 albums, didn't they?
This one especially though, because it was so sort of low and menacing, and I think they hated the experimentation. It's a bit like Star Wars, if you forgive an analogy. Like critically, this was not well received. But fuck them. I mean, here we are.
Sign of quality though.
Yeah,
critics hate everything.
Gabe, what are your preliminary thoughts on this? I don't know if you'd heard this before or what you're saying.
This was my first time listening to this record, the riff just blew me away. The drumming is absolutely insane, and like on the one hand, it's got this experimental background, or sort of like you can feel them trying out new stuff on multiple tracks. At the same time, the album closer is like the most Sabbath there ever was. It's just like they created their quintessential sound in part through this record. It's hard to sort of describe what I mean exactly, but just like the sounds are very Sabbath on that particular track for me, and like in a crystallized way that is impressive.
I would actually take that a step further. I know I'm getting a little ahead of us here, but I think Into the Void is probably the archetypal heavy metal song, not just Sabbath, but metal in general. I think if you were to put a metal song on, the golden record that went off with the Voyager probes or whatever, I think that Into the Void is probably the song I'd put on that if you had to pick one.
And it's fitting for what it's doing.
And it's it's the one that pissed off the band members the most. Like Ward and Ozzy both had difficulty executing it, and they had to like keep redoing it. And the work shows, as somebody who grades a lot of papers, I guess that's true of several of us, like you could definitely see the work they put in on that song in particular. And I agree with you, there's like little kernels of thrash and various other things in it.
I mean, that riff is fucking iconic.
The beast.
Well, there's several iconic riffs on this album, which is amazing considering it's like 8 tracks. But
but you can say that about every Black Sabbath album. I think that we've
not every one of them, but the first 4, yes.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like the ones we reviewed, everyone we reviewed so far,
yeah,
it's just everything in those albums. Just it's so iconic because it is that foundation that everything that we know of metal spawned from it.
In a lot of ways, yes, 100%. And part of the thing that really has always amazed me about Black Sabbath and the sound is how immense the sound is with only 3 musicians. I mean, Ozzy's vocals are Ozzy's vocals, and I love Ozzy, but I'm not going to pretend that he's the best vocalist in the world. But that's neither here nor there. It works. But the way that Geezer plays bass, he doesn't play bass as a supporting instrument. Yes, it's locked into what Bill Ward is doing on drums, and it complements Tony's guitar playing, but he plays it almost like well, we just did the Black album. So James Hetfield as a rhythm guitar player, a lot of that is echoed in the way that the way that Geezer is playing his bass. It's not just a support instrument. It is right up there in co-lead with the guitars. And I
he plays it like a guitar.
Yeah, totally. He's chording. He's not just plucking out notes on the strings. Yeah.
Same thing with Steve Harris played the same way. I mean, those are the real great
I was going to mention
the best
Steve
bassists
Harris.
play it like a guitar. So.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's literally, I was like, you mean like Steve Harris? I mean, but that's also, in both cases, that's what happens when you actually are helping, and indeed the primary songwriter for a lot. I mean, just the amount of Newstead is the contrasting example. And that's not blaming Newstead, but they didn't let him write shit. So, yeah, I think this is the sort of becomes, to me, the prototypical bass player that's not just in the background.
Well, that's another good point too, though, is because Geezer is so instrumental because he also writes the majority of the lyrics. This is one of the few cases where the singer doesn't write their own lyrics all the time.
Cannibal Corpse.
I know there's some of that in Iron Maiden too, but
yeah, it's all Geezer.
So, anything else before we move on to the tracks?
Yeah, probably. I got all kinds of notes. I just had some general things about their sounds. Like, I mean, Geezer's, the sound of his bass is almost doubled from this to the previous album. I don't know if you went back and listened to how much more massive it is. And that's what happens when you record over more than 2 days.
Well, in the first album, Geezer had a large prominent low in the sound of the first one as well.
But a little bit less than the second one. I just wanted to give a shout out to Ward. Man, his drumming is so fucking good. It's almost always just the tiniest bit off, and I think that it's very much on purpose to create this little bit of syncopation.
Especially on Children of the Grave.
Yes, I know that's the one I'm thinking of here. Those little tiny and very deliberate lags are fantastic. And it's a bit almost like jazz drumming. It's just so cool and casual, and he makes it sound effortless. But as Gabe pointed out, the drumming on here is epic. He makes it sound sort of simple. He himself said he got a bigger bass drum. This is also the first time he played with overdubs, so there was some stuff he did to get this sound. And Ozzy, this is what I said to you guys when I was listening to it the first time. Man, is he so good on here. Like, it's amazing what you can do when you've not snorted thousands of ants and have yet to, I don't know, ingest bat blood. Now, he obviously wasn't free of drugs, but like in terms of his lungs functioning, he's in absolute peak form here.
One of the things that I love is they were talking to Tony Iommi about this, and they actually downtuned a little bit more on this album than they had on the previous two. And they said they did that to make it easier to sing, but then Ozzy came in and just sang everything higher than he had on the previous two albums anyway.
Oh my God. Can I read you a quote from Black Sabbath Symptom of the Universe, the biography?
Of course.
I love this. Quote, the Sabbath sound took a plunge into even greater darkness, bereft even of reverb, leaving their sound as dry as old bones dug up from some desert burial plot. The finished album's brutish force would so alarm critics, they would punish Sabbath in print for being blatantly thuggish, purposely mindless, creepy, and obnoxious. 20 years later, groups like Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden, in particular Nirvana, would excavate the same heaving lung sound and be rewarded with critical garlands, end quote.
I think that's also probably due to reviewers didn't quite know how to, even after 2 albums, did not know how to take Black Sabbath.
It also shows the divide between who is writing reviews and who's listening to the music.
Indeed.
Because I'm sure that, the review writers then were probably closer to our age now.
Agreed.
So, I mean, fuck, that means that what they grew up listening to was 50s shit, kind of in the same ways that Black Sabbath did. But, so they're judging it on an earlier paradigm. And let's be clear, this was up until very recently, review writing was kind of an elite thing because you only wrote it in like Rolling Stone or Spin or some magazine or BBC or some other form. So it was a much more restricted, accessible thing in a way that when we talked about SoundScan opening up to see what sales truly were, there was and probably still is, a very large disconnect then to what critics are listening to and writing about and what the general populace finds entertaining when they listen to stuff or consume media of any kind.
I want to give one last shout out that connects to where Gabe got on the heavy music train. And I'd not quite thought of it this way, but I read an interview with Billy Corgan where he was crediting this with being the establishment of grunge. I usually think of Led Zeppelin, right? That's the train. It goes from Zeppelin to they rediscover that, but he's like, no, it was Sabbath. which is not something that had occurred to me. And now I know Ben's making a face, but that's what he said. And I know he's not the Pope of grunge, but he's a little closer to it than any of us on this Zoom call are.
I don't know, if you asked him, he might say he's the Pope of grunge.
Yeah, he might. He totally might. But I just want to echo that this thing spawned not only multiple genres within metal, but arguably even other genres entirely that Ben thinks are metal. We've had this discussion, like, is grunge metal? It's a discussion for another time. But
So, gentlemen, what do you think of it? What's some tracks you like off of it?
I think it's weird they started side B with an instrumental, but why not? Because I know, I didn't listen to this on vinyl, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but I didn't. But Sweet Leaf is a kick-ass opener, man. And they flat out said, like, we were doing an enormous quantity of drugs and wanted to sort of work through that. And I want to point out how transgressive this was. This doesn't seem like it now in the era of, like, I could just go to Illinois and buy an edible. That is not a thing in this era. This is an era where people are going to jail for 40 fucking years for simple possession. It was worse in the US than in Britain. So I'm not trying to say they're sort of hardcore radicals, but again, you hear this now and you're like, oh, that's cute. Like, no, dude, this was hardcore to be engaging with us in such a blunt and blatant way. And I love that it's literally Iommi coughing. Like, that's what that sample is Ozzy brings, like, a Biggie small size blunt and then just almost kills the guitarist. And here it is forever. After Forever, of course, is fantastic. It's very much a quintessential Sabbath song. Children of the Grave, I think I said this to you all in the chat when I was listening to it. This is the riff that launched 1,000 riffs. Like, the amount of songs that are derivative of either After Forever, Children of the Grave, or Into the Void is just sort of stunning. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean, you sort of, you go with the best. I had forgotten how damn cool Children of the Grave was. I could maybe do without Embryo. I don't know. It's sort of a throwaway to me. But the drums in it are amazing. I think, is there timpani in there? I swear to God, that's what it sounded like.
In Children of the Grave, I think
yes,
so.
I think it's a timpani. I was like, damn, Bill. Anyway, Orchid is pretty. It's fine. Lord of this World, I've written here, Sabbath as fuck. Quintessential Black Sabbath song. It has cowbell, and then it just disappears all of a sudden. Solitude, I wrote exactly what Buck said, Planet Caravan 2, The Reckoning, except this time flutes. So, and you know what, why the hell not? And then Into the Void is such a kick-ass closer. I mean, that song, I would be willing to launch that song into space on the Buck constructed satellite for the aliens. I mean, it's I'd say it's a good contender. I know I'm sort of raving about most of these. The experimental stuff is meh, but I don't know. It's the thing is, it's woven together in a way that it doesn't bother me, because sometimes instrumental tracks or experimental tracks really piss me off, as you all know. But here, I don't know. It's just, the whole thing just seems to work, and it's in 34 minutes, it's done. You're like off the ride already.
I'm gonna pair it what David said, and just really every track on this album is fantastic and it serves its purpose. I even like Embryo and Orchid. I enjoy the experimental instrumentals they put on here. But Children of the Grave, I think, is the song that I keep coming back to off this album, just of how fantastic it is.
I've always viewed the instrumentals as just introductions. Like, Embryo is, to me, is just a part of Children of the Grave. I've always viewed it that way, so I've never had a problem with it. I think the only major complaint I would leverage against this album is it's really, really short, 30-some minutes. I think there could have been another song. What's that?
So that's one of the things that I love about it.
I know. I was just gonna say, I think there could be one more full-length song just to kind of round it all out. But it's neither here nor there. Everything on here is absolute classic, as you guys have been mentioning. I mean, there's not much I can really add to it.
I was gonna say, Ben is the person who thinks the last album that they released in 2020 was the perfect length album of all time.
I do.
Sabbath?
No, Vader.
Oh, okay. I missed the Vader part.
Yeah.
I prefer shorter albums, but 40 minutes. I think 34 minutes, you cut out, not including the instrumentals, it pushes you down into like 32. I think there could have been one more song, but
yeah, my personal sweet spot is 30 to 45 usually, but this fits right in there. And there's not really anything that I can add to what David said about all of them. Sweet Leaf suffers from some of the same things that any album of this age is going to. You hear it so much that I'm a little bit burnt out on it, but it's still fucking awesome. I much prefer, I think that whoever sequenced this album did a brilliant job in closing out the sides, because Children of the Grave and Into the Void are two of the best metal songs, period. And having those close out your sides was a brilliant move.
And I just want to tag on to something that David said earlier about sort of the sound of the record. And like, one of the most impressive things to me are the synth noises on After Forever and Children of the Grave. Like, they're really out there. You're just like, what is that? And then on Children of the Grave, it's just this high note that is creepy as shit. And it's just amazing. So there are no bad songs on here. They're just, two songs that I think are just okay. One being The Very Short Embryo and the other being Solitude. It's just kind of sleepy and, not really in their wheelhouse, but it's like, it's okay. But it's a great, great record.
Yeah, it's an album definitely meant to be enjoyed under the influence of certain drugs.
Buck, of course,
how it's
means
written.
Buck, of course, means friendship and loving your neighbor and sunshine.
Yep. Going to church on Sundays.
Yeah.
Going to church on Sundays. That is what both Buck and Black Sabbath are advocating here.
Well, here especially, and I think that that's worth pointing
Yes.
out, because this is the album where they're like, hey, we would keep getting accused of being into black magic and Satanism. Maybe we are a little bit, or at least some of the band is, but let's come out and unequivocally state our place with After Forever. So,
Yeah, no kidding. We might hang the Pope. It's possible. And Geezer, I'd forgotten that he was Catholic, which is somewhat of a rarity in England. But he was working through some shit. But sounds great.
sure does.
Go back to what you mentioned earlier, I can't remember if it was you, Ben, or David, but you're talking about contextualize as a reviewer, contextualizing this, to the early 70s, where your critics and whatnot are rooted in the 50s and that 50s and 60s eras of music and stuff like that. Things like, we laugh at like, some of these darker satanic, et cetera, themes, but back then too, that was still a pretty pretty no territory, not to
very taboo.
ever touch. You mean in a lot of ways, some of these early Sabbath, brushes with the occult, if you want to call it that, and putting it lightly, is establishing kind of the thematics of heavy metal. It's distinct musically, obviously, but it needs that sort of lyrical, that image to kind of back up the heaviness of the music. And Sabbath really laid that down too. It gets ridiculous over the years, but I think it's an interesting point to kind of contextualize to 72, when you're putting out songs like After Forever, it's a much bigger deal than it is now.
By the early 80s, bands were paying for that.
Yeah.
Like the Satanic Panic and what happened with Judas Priest. And so, now it just seems, and I'm guilty of that too. I'm like, deicide, whatever. But that's not in the 70s and early 80s, man. That was, especially in America.
Yeah,
without a doubt. Tracey, did you mention the tracks you liked?
I said I was going to pair David and really enjoy Children of the Grave.
He said he likes them all.
Kind of likes them all. All right, so it's time to grade this thing, and I put in our grading rubric that we don't follow very well, but we have anyway. As you can see, if it is an A+, it's an album forged by the metal gods and gifted unto us unworthy mortals, and it goes down from there to an F. It's an abomination in this realm or any other. I don't think that that's going to be in play for this album, but who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
I'm just kidding.
I got David down as a D. You know how he feels about it, really. I'll go first. I think this is a great album, and according to a grader, I'm gonna give it a legendary album. I think it's just slightly a little less than Paranoid, and I think we all gave that A+. So just a little underneath that one.
That's pretty much what I was going to say, almost verbatim. So yeah, I'm giving it an A2.
Same. Paranoid is a slightly better album, but this is still a legendary album.
Yeah, it's an A for me too.
This is going to shock you. I'm going to come in an 8 as well. It almost gets into A+ territory. There's some ways in which I actually like it almost more than Paranoid, but Paranoid was even more significant historically. So, I think this deserves an A's across the board. It's definitely legendary.
Well, there we go. Our first YouTube video, and we're all in agreement that it's amazing.
Rarely happens. It will never happen again.
A lot.
Yeah, it doesn't happen a whole lot, especially with the 5 of us. Well, Thank you all, everyone, for listening. If you are a fan of the podcast, which you can find on Spotify and Apple, stick around because we're going to do a breakdown of the last year. But we're going to end the YouTube here. We thank you for giving us a shot. We hope that you will like, subscribe, and share. Also, go check out Buck's work on his various projects. And if Tracey ever gets Cloaca Metal back going, check that out as well. Tracey, what are we doing next time?
Next time, we are looking at the much requested Iron Maiden Power Slave.
I've heard of it.
What? I don't think I have. What is this Power Slave?
I hate you.
Is that the band that put out Look What the Cat Dragged In?
Iron what?
Oh my God. I
Iron
hate all of
Priest.
you.
All right.
My dad joke for the night.
Nice.
But yes, Power Slave by Iron Maiden. Join us
Excellent.
next time.
Thank you.